5, 6, 7, 8. Hello.
Hello.
How are you feeling? You sound a bit hoarse.
I am a little bit, I've got my like croaky podcast voice on today. No, I have some sort of daycare disease, but that's par for the course at the moment. I'm good. I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm childless by choice and therefore feeling fabulous.
You bitch. Someday I just, want to live my life with you, Boyson. I want to. Let's trade lives just for a week. Just
Oh
for
my gosh. But listen, this is the Smart and Public podcast where we discuss business, careers, and life through the eyes of public relations and communications experts. I'm Katie Boyson,
And I'm Katie Douglasy.
and here we go. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Before we
Well,
dive in, I have to say, I am spending my day today, other than this, which, is highly important and I prioritized, I'm having a me day. And you know what I've been watching? And please tell me you've been watching it
hit me
because
with it.
we need to talk about it. The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives.
That's right in the sweet
Wow.
spot.
I'm shocked. Yeah, it's something that also Andrew's away for work. And so it's something that I can also watch in the evening because he would definitely not watch that with me. He was home. So it's been nice. I get the kids to bed and then I'm like, hit me. Hit me with the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives.
Now, if anyone hasn't watched it, it essentially talks about this TikTok group of Mormon wives that started doing like dances and stuff, and then a scandal unravels pretty quickly. Like, you're up to speed in the first episode. I don't want to spoil anything, but the scandals are not what you would expect from a Mormon lifestyle. Like, I thought the scandal was going to be like, she drank a vodka soda, and it's much more scandalous than that. It is very funny.
But then it just continues. Like then I just feel like I'm living a more pure life than these women. And it's like I'm not even remotely. Anyway, it's great. Either way.
It's juicy. Yeah.
Yeah, it's juicy. I mean, they're also so young.
I
They're so young. And they've got so many babies. And like, wow.
know.
It's
I
amazing. It's
know.
worth a watch. I was looking for like that tune out your brain, put something on, feel good about your life afterwards. Go for it.
Yeah, even Scotty, like, I had it on for a little bit and I realized he was in the room and I was like, oh, I'll turn it off. Like, I'll watch this at another time. And he's like, no, go on.
Leave it on. Yeah. Yeah, amazing. But I have to say, I also binged Nobody Wants This with
Huge fan.
yeah.
Huge fan.
I'm
It's
just
so
gonna
cool.
call him like Seth from the OC because why would I call him actual name when
Right.
all I'm associating with is the OC? But man, like I've been seeing all these posts of like I'm back in love with Seth, and I'm like, same, babe, same.
It's just so cute too. Like, it is a little piece of every single person on the planet and how they feel about going through relationships or getting left behind or anything like that.
And she's just so like equal parts, like, yeah, like I don't care what anyone thinks. And then she's like so neurotic. Anyway, also worth a watch, guys. I think Nobody Wants This. I don't know what it's on in the US, but
Netflix.
oh, it's Netflix. Oh, it's all Netflix then. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah,
there's TV reviews for this week.
yeah. Perfect. Love it. Okay, let's get into the topic. So, we have been getting a ton of listener emails about things they want to cover in a full episode or quick questions. We're loving that, by the way. If you have topics or ideas that you want us to cover, or you have feedback, or maybe if we messed up on something, feel free to correct us or share a separate opinion. You can email us at hello@smartandpublicpod.com. We read all of your emails. We'll write back to you as well. Like, we're really just loving that feedback and the interaction that we're getting. So we thought we would use this episode to respond to a couple of the questions that we've gotten, that some of them are going to be a full episode in themselves. So we've kind of saved some of those questions aside. But these are the ones that we thought we could just jump on and address.
Let's do it. I'm excited.
Do you want me to read the first one?
Yeah, hit me.
Cool. All right. So I'm going to read this as it was written. So just bear with me because I write how I talk and I do not read how other people talk very well. So.
I don't read good.
I also can't read, so that's a different issue. Okay, media accountability. I loved the hot take of the political debate and as a different take on it. Is this working? Are you following? Um, I don't know why I can't do this. I'm nervous. What's the media's role in responsible and credible journalism, and how accountable are they for it? Because just politically, seeing what's happening in Australia on so many sensitive topics like domestic violence, Gaza, etc., it feels like there isn't much.
Juicy.
So media accountability.
Media accountability. Okay. I will start, but I would love your perspective as well, especially in the US and what you're seeing from that perspective. But there's kind of a couple of ways to look at this. I think first and foremost, there's like basic accountability. And I think to some extent my experience has been, and I'll say what I mean by basic accountability in a minute, but my experience has been that has deteriorated slightly as the newsroom has got smaller and more fast paced and a little bit more challenging for journalists. And what I mean by that is there's been times, where we've done a story and it's gone up and there's just basic stuff that is not fact checked or is wrong. I've had an exec's name be misspelt several times and then had to go back a couple of times to get that fixed. And that's pretty basic stuff, right? So I think the speed at which, to some extent, stories are being churned out now, the style in which people are writing, I think everything being online means that you can change things pretty easily, through digital. So therefore, do we need to be as thorough as if we were printing it? So I do think as a whole, if we just take those sort of basic levels of accountability, I feel like that's gone down a little bit from when I started. And I think there's something to be said about, working with journalists. And this is not a shit on journalists, by the way. I think it's actually gotten to be a really hard job. And I think it's a hard place to be in the newsroom. But I do think there's some level of accountability that needs to come back into not just, and I hate the word lazy, but like doing that a little bit more due diligence. I then think there's like this bigger story about accountability, which is I think what the question is kind of asking is like not just accountability, but credibility. And like, how are we writing stories? And are those stories influenced by a particular viewpoint or a particular bias? And I think more and more we're seeing publications have a political lean, and it might be that they're controlled by one particular family who we all know who that family is. And that
Voldemort,
means they lean to the right. Thou shalt not be named. And they lean to the right. And so therefore, if you're doing a story with them, there's always going to be a level of conservatism that might be involved. And I think in different countries, this has different, we're talking about Western democracy to some extent. I think if you then look at some markets where the government controls the media, it's a whole other level of accountability. So I don't want to touch those necessarily because we're not sitting in those markets. I'm talking about even in a free press market, in a democracy, we're seeing, I think, a lot more political influence into media. So I think there's that big level of accountability. And I know from a domestic violence point of view in Australia, and the question asked about that, I think we're still seeing media write those stories as if there's some victim shaming involved. I think there's been a big call in Australia to be really careful as media when you're writing those stories to think about the way in which you're positioning the victim, and that if someone is a victim of domestic violence, that's not on them. And yet there's still language that some media are using. So it worries me a little bit. And I think people need to be really conscious of the environment in which media are operating and why they're writing the story they're writing and why the headline is the headline.
I find it really surprising that there's still that victim blaming, particularly in Australia, with some of those headlines and the way that they're positioned. I remember 3 or 4 years ago, there was that big kind of push with the private school boys, and Lisa Wilkinson came out and talked about, it's not about having your daughters act differently. It's about teaching your boys not to rape kind of language, And I thought that would be a huge wake up call in the press of just how women are treated in headlines and how domestic violence would then filter on and come to life when they talked about it in the media.
Yeah, I think we're still a country that's really struggling with domestic violence. We have some of the worst statistics in the world in terms of women being killed by their intimate partners, men too, but predominantly women. And so I think we've gotten better, but I still think there is a big challenge in the way that some of this is reported, the way the men are written about, all of that sort of stuff. So I think there needs to be a lot more accountability from a media standpoint in the way, if we're going to tackle this problem, the media are part of it, right? And they're not at all, the sole part of the problem, but they're a part of the situation and the way it perpetuates in society. So yeah, I would love to see that change. But I do think, like, from a personal perspective, I get my news from lots of different sources. And I think that's probably the other piece is, like, I think we've moved beyond like reading one thing and going, oh yeah, that's the truth,
Yeah. And I think that's actually a common practice with PR people is to read the same story from different publications to get the angles. And so I think that's a best practice that I think other people can then learn to pick up from PR people and how we assess the news and what the actual landscape of the story is turning out to be. I agree. I think that reading more than one source is always the best way to kind of start if you're actually interested in a topic and want to read through the full article anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I think as well, we talked about this in the paid, owned and earned discussion podcast that came out 2 weeks ago. But like, also look at, like, if it's a company, for example, and you're reading an earned media story, go and see what's on their owned properties. Go and look at the CEO's LinkedIn. Like, there are ways that you can sort of piece together, to your point, like the story. If you're thinking this doesn't quite sound right, or I'd want to know more, or I want to understand their perspective on an issue, like it might be a company that's in crisis, right? And you see one interview or one story and you think, oh, well, they're terrible. Well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. But I think that culture of, like, we just need to not just be reading one thing and then going, yeah, that's gospel and, the journalist is right.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's two kind of pieces here. There's the accountability from the journalists and from the publications. And then there's also kind of accountability on ourselves to implement critical thinking in a time where there's just so much news. And I think that's such an important message of, like, we have to have our own brains in this situation as well. And I think with the questions that we're getting around accountability in journalism and the news that we're reading, it's more important than ever to decide for yourself and therefore do the right research and due diligence to make sure that you have your full opinion formed.
I think that's what makes it hard, is that, like, for some people, they just want to watch the news and feel like they're getting factual information that is not, biased in any way. And I think this is where it gets complicated, because even if you look at the Fox News example around the election, the previous election, where there was the story about, the votes being rigged and all that sort of stuff, and it came up in a show I was watching recently. But how much accountability does a network have when they report on something that then turns out to be not true? And obviously they were taken to court on that, and it was a big court case, but they still did it. And a lot of people thought it to be true, right? Because they reported it. And so this, like, level of responsibility for big news publications to do better, I think, is really important. But yeah, I think as individuals, we have to kind of know that now and be aware of that.
Yeah, and I think with the election this year, the US definitely knows that there is a huge mess to clean up in terms of accountability in journalism. And you can see that even with the vice presidential debate and the presidential debate a few weeks ago, the fact checking that they're trying to do live on the debate. Because I think there's just been so much criticism, and still, like, they're still not quite getting it right, but that effort is being made, because there's even conversations around who gets to moderate the debate so that it's not biased, because there's so much conversation that's happening back and forth in the US right now. So they've got a long way to go. I think there's definitely still that vein of, if you're Republican, you read these newspapers, and if you're a Democrat, you read these newspapers. But you can tell that there's a conscious effort in actual reporting and in the moderation of the vice presidential debate, as an example, where they're trying to show that they are both sided and non-biased is a better word for that.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually, I've just had a thought. We have two journos coming up as guests. We won't
Mm,
reveal yet, but we're going to be interviewing them soon. So I think this is also a really good one to ask
yeah,
them how they view accountability and what they're held to from an accountability standard
yeah,
at their publications. That'll be really
yeah.
interesting.
I think that's a great idea. So hold us to it. We'll put it, listeners. We'll put it in the briefing book. Yes, we do send briefing books because we are PR people. So,
Naturally. Yeah.
okay. So let's go into question 2. All right, you
Yeah.
ready?
Yeah, I'm
Okay.
ready.
All right, let me just read this again. So, I'm not moving back to Australia anytime soon, but saw someone who wrote something on Mamma Mia saying they've just moved back to Oz after a stint abroad, and all their professional experience they accumulated feels tossed. Is this common?
Hmm. As the Australian, do you want me to start with this one or do you want to
Yeah, I
start with?
was gonna say, I find this one really interesting because one, we have an Australian who, that's the end of the sentence. We have an Australian. And the second one is, I moved careers 10 years in and
Yeah.
have my own experiences of what that looks like. And then like 18 years into my career, moved back. So I think we've got a lot of good insights to share. I'll let you kick it off though, Duffy.
Cool. So just so if any of the listeners are in the US, Mamma Mia is an independent publishing house here. So it sounds like it was an article that someone read or on a forum on that. Look, I don't agree with this, but I can only answer this from my perspective and my industry. So I'll do it from that. I mean, I'm not disputing that this person felt that way. I'm not sure what industry that person was in, but I think from my perspective, if someone was moving, because it sounds like this is someone who's moved home, who was Australian and has moved home and has had all this global experience, to me, that would be a total asset. But that's coming from an industry that is I was working for a global company, a multinational company. So having people who'd worked in different markets in my team was only a benefit, I felt, because we had to work globally anyway. So understanding different markets, different culture sets, all of that sort of stuff was only a benefit. I also think technology is becoming more global. I don't see it as something that is a skill set that you need specifically from a different market but I do think maybe in our industry, from a comms perspective, sometimes there's a fear, and I want you to kind of talk to this because you've done it both ways. There's a fear that, oh, well, you don't have the media contacts because you haven't been here for 10 years. I don't buy into that. Like, I think that's like literally sending an email or a call or bumping into them at an event or just building your network back up. And I think that takes work, but I don't think that's something that would stop me from hiring someone and saying like, oh, all of that experience you have in that other market is worthless because you don't know who writes the tech pages for the Oz. So for me, I don't find this to be true. I've never hired that way. I love international experience. I love Australians who've gone overseas and come back. I think that's awesome. So yeah, it's not been my experience, but what do you think?
Well, I think, and we can only speak obviously to PR and what our
Yeah.
experiences are.
Yeah.
Um, but I think your network is critical. So before I even moved over to Australia, I was networking with people that I at least knew over there or was connected to over there just to pick their brains. Like, what blogs are you reading? Like, what is coming through in the news for you? How are you finding the job market? Like, what is the challenges that you're facing in interviews? What's breaking through? Do I need this type of visa? Like, there is a bunch of things that you can be asking and building up and connecting with people to learn from before you go over. Because obviously a big move like that, it it takes time anyway to get over. So in that preparation, start planning ahead of time. I started networking like a year before I even moved to Australia because I knew I was going to do it.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing is that from a PR perspective, your skills are completely transferable. And to your point, Dovesy, I think that they're actually a benefit to any company that's looking to add someone on their team, particularly if that company is looking to expand into new markets. And so you've got that experience. What I would say is that if you how depends on how badly you want to come over, but yes, my skills were transferable, but was I a director of PR in, let's say I'm a director of PR in the US, am I actually qualified to be a director of PR in Australia based on the lack of journalism contacts, the lack of context of the market, learning the nuances and what it means to speak to the national agenda? Like, maybe not. And so I actually took a demotion to move over to Australia.
Yeah.
And I was okay with that. That was something that was my personal decision. Do I feel like I ever moved backwards in my career? Absolutely not. Like, I think it takes a bit of actually understanding where you are in your career and if you're willing to make that sacrifice. For me, I was, and it actually, I think, gave me the opportunity to work under people because of that I wouldn't have necessarily worked under if I had come over in my current role. And I learned a shit ton from it. Like, I'm so glad that I did that in the long run.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. But you're right. I also think sometimes a regional role versus some of the roles in the US is much broader. And so therefore, like, the leveling is not always the same. So yeah, I think being open to, like, what am I going to learn? What job am I, like, don't worry about the level so much is always what I think to people is, like, as long as it's not super far removed,
Yeah,
then I think it's okay. But the other, like you said, like, this is PR. Like, they might have been talking about, like, medicine or nursing.
so true.
I don't know. Maybe there is some, like, experience in certain markets that, as Australians, we go, nah, that doesn't suit our health system. I have no idea. But in PR, I don't see this as a challenge at all, and I think it's a benefit that people become more global. So yeah,
It's less, I think also selling yourself is important. Like, it is less about, is all my experience washed, and can I spin this? Can I turn this story on
yeah,
its head and position myself as somebody that has seen different markets and can bring in new ideas and perspectives? And ooh, I saw this cool thing in Singapore. Why don't we try it out with a publication here? I think that's such a benefit to your career.
like the moving markets and coming home, like, it takes a lot of bravery, it takes a lot of flexibility, it takes a lot of adaptability. Like, think about the skill sets you learn in moving, right? Not just the PR skill sets, but, like, you have to build culture pretty quickly because you're going into a new market, you don't know anyone. Like, there's a lot of things you learn from that. And I think, yeah, I totally agree with you. Sell it. Like, yeah.
Yeah, you got to sell it. What I would say,
Experience, they're not the right place for you to work anyway.
that's true. Dump them. Move
Yeah.
back home. No, just kidding. No, the one thing I would say is going from Australia to the US, I found to be a little bit more difficult from a media perspective. Yes and no. So, one, the markets are completely different for PR people and the challenges that we face and what pitching looks like and what time looks like for journalists. Um, there's just, a gajillion publications over here and they're all slammed and all the cycles go at the same time. So I feel like every time I'm doing a funding announcement, there's 400 other people doing a funding announcement at that time. And I'm like, okay, whose body do we have to sell to get this over the line? But I don't advise that. That's not actually, that's no, not mine, someone else's. It is a completely different market in that way. But if you are willing to be vulnerable and put yourself out there, I did find when I was getting stuck in the US, my contacts in the US were more than willing to give me pointers. Like, people were so helpful. So that's where your network comes back in. Also, reaching out to some journalists that I hadn't talked to in a decade since living in Australia and reaching back out and being like, hey, remember me? And they were like, yeah, great to see you're doing your own thing. Like, keep me in the loop. And I was like, oh shit. Like, I'm so glad this person remembers me. And that was it. All it took was just being a bit vulnerable for a minute. And then it all went back into the wheel and it was fine.
I completely agree. Yeah. So,
okay, great. Let's move on. Next question. I want to hear your working definition of comms. As someone who has been in and out of the field, but around it for 15 years, the industry still feels loosely defined, which can be part of its definition. So customer success and many other functions feel this way also. I found myself kind of craving you both to champion an articulation, and that could even evolve over time, of what and where it is and where it's going. She's talking about the definition of comms, especially if the audience is broad, like if you're speaking to founders or people without comms experience. Now, my urge, because when I read things, sometimes my initial urge is to answer them literally and then take a step back and then try to get creative about the literal answer. So let me just tell you what my urge wants to do. My urge, I want to say something so profound right now. Like, I want to put together 2 sentences of what comms is and then be like, let's sell this as a workshop. That's what I want to do. But
podcast, because we want to.
we were talking about this in our kind of discussion, like production call yesterday, and Duffy, you actually had a really good way of kind of stringing this together without me ruining it through profound 2 sentences.
And I don't feel well today, so who knows if it's gonna come out the right way. So first of all, I really enjoy that this person has so much faith in us to champion and articulate the definition of comms. I'm like, I don't know. That feels like way too much for both of us. Here's how I think about it. And like, please write in. Like, I don't think this is the be all and end all, but this is how I've always tried to kind of articulate it for myself. I think fundamentally comms people are storytellers. And it's our job to go and find the stories that matter and who our audience is that needs to hear that story. And that might be an internal audience, it might be an external audience, it might be looking at, the lack of stories and figuring out where we can find a story in a lack of stories. It might be going, you know what, we've got this kind of loose story, but actually it needs something better. But if you think about it as storytelling, I think people think that's simple, but actually really good storytelling is really hard to do. And it requires a certain skill set. And that skill set is like a combination of this ability to use language and think about the way in which you use language, but also you have to be able to read people really well. You have to be able to build networks across the organization, because you will not find those stories if people don't like you or don't know you. Like, part of being a good comms person in-house is being able to go, I'm going to go and talk to that person because I think there'd be a really interesting thing there. And actually that engineer is super smart. Maybe I can get something out of that, or whatever it might be. And then on the agency side, I think it's like articulating or helping your client articulate that story and understanding that external world in terms of, is that story the right story for right now? What's happening in that external market? So I see it as like, we are the storytellers. We are the brand storytellers. We are the keeper of the stories. I don't know if that's, helpful for people. That's how I've explained it to like other people who aren't in comms. Maybe not at like a founder CEO level, but like, if I'm talking to a friend, I'm like, okay, so, I see myself as a storyteller for a brand. I go and find these great stories. Let me give you an example. And then I use examples of like the types of stories. So that's how I think about it. I don't know. Does that resonate? Not resonate?
It does resonate. I mean, I think positioning PR people and comms people as storytellers is the perfect start. I think people get lost in trying to explain the deliverables of what we do. And that's where things can get muddy, because deliverables can be many things, and some of them are out of our control, like an earned piece of coverage, right?
Yeah.
Or, I write FAQs, and then you're using like language that only inside baseball people know. So I think trying to broaden it out and say that we are the storytellers for the business. And because we read and consume news and other stories better than I think anybody else within that kind of business structure, it almost makes us like puzzle piece finders, and we can patch things together because we're constantly listening, asking questions, because we're always thinking about, what is the story here? What are we trying to tell?
And look, I understand people want a really high level business sounding, like, we're the strategic arm of the business that drives messages down into the blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, we do that. Cool. But like, I don't know if that emotes people enough to go, I want to know more about that industry, or I want to work in that industry. I think the other thing about the question is, like, to me, it doesn't bother me that we don't have a defined, like, really clear answer of what comms is. I actually think that's the beauty of it, is that we evolve as the industry evolves. Any one comms job might look different. Like, you and I won't reveal the story, but you and I were talking yesterday about a really interesting role that someone did that was like purely like issues and crisis at a global level, right? And that is not anywhere near my day job, right? And yet we're both comms people. And so I think to me that doesn't bother me. Like I don't have this desire or need to articulate it so much that we put ourselves into a space that limits what I can do. And like if you think about my definition, like we aren't the only storytellers of a business. You could say that about marketers, right? Like and I think that's a good thing. Like we should be working really closely with marketing. They have a different end goal though. And I think, you know, they're KPI differently, but at the end of the day, we could partner together to tell that story. So I just think it's me personally, I'm not hung up on like really trying to get to a definition that everyone feels, because I just don't know that we'll all agree as an industry, because I think we're all doing really different things. Yeah, I think it's okay to be a little bit fluid, but that's how I think about it in terms of how to explain it. But how do you explain it to like a founder or, you know, a new client who's never had comms?
Look, I explain it very similarly. What I do is I go in and I first identify the audience that they're trying to speak to, and then I work backwards from there. So it's very similar to kind of what you just described as we are storytellers, but I do it from a business opportunity perspective. So you are doing a funding announcement, you need support with that. I'm the person that's going to be able to help your CEO and speak to your investors, your potential customers, and your ecosystem about XYZ. You know, so it really just, it's a level or a notch deeper when you're talking to somebody that doesn't understand comms, about honing in on the audience and adding that into how you position it.
Yeah. But yeah, look, I think I would just encourage people to not get hung up on it and just create a definition that works for you, that works for the business you're in, that you feel comfortable describes what you do, you know, on a day-to-day basis. Like I think it's okay that we're all a bit loose about it. I don't mind it. We can change.
Yeah. And if you want to get creative, like maybe work backwards the same way that I work backwards from audience that I'm trying to connect with for my clients. Like you could think about it as we have a comms team and here are our metrics for success. So we tell stories to help the business achieve XYZ metric, and by telling stories about blah blah blah. Like that's how you could do that. Just work backwards from what your outcome it needs to be.
Yeah.
If someone has
an articulate a definition, if someone has a better one, please write in. I'm open to it.
Like we would love to hear other people's perspectives. I know in the mixing board community that I'm a part of, they've been kind of working on a project like this. I have loosely been following with one eyeball.
I think this also comes back to like, as a profession, I don't think we're great at like creating a culture around our profession too much. Like we don't have as strong, there are industry bodies, but not at a sort of global level. At a national level, there are groups, you know, we have the PRIA here, Public Relations Institute of Australia. But like I would say in general, like if you look at like lawyers or doctors, it's very defined. Although within lawyers, of course, there's a million different types of lawyer you can be. But I think as an industry, we're not as good at that. And I think having a little bit more structure around, you know, great communities, like Mixing Board's doing a great job.
Yeah.
Like we've been calling out for that, I think, for a while, like better community, better global sharing, you know, like I think we do a better job of having like global events where we can get together and share ideas. There are some, a lot of them are in the US. There's not, you know, there's a couple in Europe. But yeah, I don't know. I think we could do a better job of that as an industry, but I don't know if that needs us to create a really narrow definition of our job, but just more recognizing that we could do a better job, I think, of like creating a global community of comms people.
Yeah, I think so. And I think everyone else is hungry for that too. Cause I've noticed like, I mean, not to keep talking about Mixing Board, but you ask a question in there and like 6 people respond and try to help you out. Like people are just so hungry for that.
But if Mixing Board do want to come on board as a sponsor, we'll have you.
Sean Garrett, colleague Sean Garrett. Okay. So here is our last question. It is, what is one PR horror story you can share and how did you address it?
So we've talked about this a little bit as we've started the pod, because I feel like the real horror stories are ones we probably just cannot share, because ultimately we have to be a vault on certain things. And there are things that I will never share because it'll be too obvious who the client was, who an individual was, blah, blah, blah. But I just thought of another thing that there was this famous, when I was at agency, there was this famous kind of PR F up. And I remember at the time, it like caused all this like news stories about the F up. But basically it was a PR person, a junior PR person sent a pitch about, I'm pretty sure it was cat food. And like, I think it kind of was like, it's good enough to eat, like that kind of vibe, you know. But sent it like to a lot of people and the wrong journalist, right? Like just did the wrong, like not did the wrong thing, like as in got bad guidance, sent out this pitch and then a journalist posted it and posted her name. Now, I don't even remember her name, but I wouldn't say it anyway, even if I did. And then it kind of did the rounds on like the PR, like at the time it was like Mumbrella. Yeah, and she was named. And there were a couple of things about it that I was like, because at the time I was probably mid-level. I wasn't junior, but I wasn't senior. And I remember I have definitely sent pictures out where like the senior person was like, hey, like, can you just get that out? And I was like, okay. And like, didn't think much about it at the time. Like, not a lot of coaching, you know? And I remember thinking that is such an easy mistake to make for your name to now be in the media. She was very junior. Like, I mean, she was probably 1 or 2 years out.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was terrible because it was about cat food, so it's funny, right? So then it wasn't picked up. But like, I just remember feeling so bad for that person. And actually the agency lead came out and like took the accountability and was like, this is not on this person. Like, we didn't support this person enough to do the right. And I actually thought that was amazing.
Yeah.
But in terms of like horror stories, like I lived in fear from that day of one of my pictures being made public. And like, so I was like, it almost made me like even more rigorous with myself, but also with my team on like, we got to be locked up on the shit we're sending out because I don't want to be that person.
I see that on Twitter so much where reporters, it's actually like a terrible culture thing that's happening right now, but reporters will post emails on Twitter and say, don't do this, please. And sometimes I'm just like, oh my God, like, can we just have a bit of grace? Everybody is miserable. Like, can you, we're just trying.
Call the person and be like, that was a shit pitch. Don't send me that again. Like, that's fine. Like, that and I get it. They're frustrated. They probably get a ton of them a day, all that sort of stuff. But like the naming and shaming seems.
I know.
And you're right. It's still happening. It's just in a little bit more of a, you know, like, but
it takes more time to post it on Twitter than it would have to just write them back in
just say,
2 sentences.
This is not relevant for me. Please don't send it to me again. Even if you want to be harsh, like I've got a lot of like harsh, you know, that's part of the job is like learning to deal with like tough, you know, just not interesting emails or like don't send, like that's okay.
Yeah.
But the naming and shaming, even then I remember being like, this poor girl has had a day, you know?
Yeah.
And then the only other thing I was going to say on horror stories is when everyone else sees like a crisis with a brand, like all I think about is the PR person that morning.
Same. I was just talking to somebody about this. Our Verizon like lines all went down for the entire day yesterday. I'm talking like you couldn't even get a phone call if you were on Wi-Fi. Like it was from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And I was talking to somebody this morning and I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. We had to reschedule this call. Like, cause she only wanted to do it on a phone call. She didn't want to get on Zoom or anything. And so I was like, so sorry we had to reschedule. Here's what was happening with the phones being down. And she was like, oh, that poor PR person. And I was like, that is exactly what I thought of.
And it's so funny because like, you know, I've got 4 kids, like the mornings are busy and, you know, the kids are doing their thing. And I always think of like, like, I don't know, an airline issue or like whatever it is. And I always think that poor PR person has literally had to like dump her kids if she has
I
them.
know.
If she doesn't, either way,
I
whatever
know.
she do, and be like, well, that's my day gone. And maybe more than a day, but at least that day you think, oh, that poor. And I remember, and it's just, I think that's just such a PR thing, is like, we don't think about the crisis itself, but we're like, that poor person. And like, you really just be like, so glad it's not me. Like, that you just know their day has just become a absolute shit show.
I'm going to make a request. I would love for people to send in like the time that they fucked up in a pitch, or like what was a funny
Yeah.
thing that now we can laugh at because it was 15 years ago. But
Yeah.
like, what was the thing that you did when you first started out in PR and you messed it up? Like, I have a million. I can share them with you when we read back some of the feedback that we get. But share your experiences. Like, let's help people grow in the industry by letting them know that they can mess up and it's all right. Like, I would love to read some of those stories and have a laugh with you, not at you.
The best for me is like when I was pitching things that I sort of understood, but not really. Had like a surface level understanding of what it did, and then had to pitch to like a very senior technology journalist who just ripped me to shreds on not understanding fully what a server did.
Oh, one time I used to represent a semiconductor company, and I pitched the journalist on email and he was interested and he called me right away
All
after
right.
the pitch to get just a few more details so he could tee it up to his editor. And I was like,
That's exactly what I mean.
like, let me just
Yeah.
get the press release up. My hands are like shaking. Oh my God. I'm like, yeah, it's,
Yep, gotta love those
uh-huh.
conductors. Yeah, that's how I felt about service. I loosely knew what they did, but I wasn't quite sure exactly what to expect.
My God, we've all been there. Let's see. We want to hear from you about it.
Yeah, I do. I want to hear all the backstories.
Okay, so if you have a topic you want to cover, or you have a horror story for us, or just write us in. Just write something. Just write in to say hi. You
Say
can
hi.
email us at hello@smartandpublicpod.com. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok at smartandpublicpod. And now we are available on anywhere you find your podcasts. So just have a look-see. And thank you so much for joining us this week, and we'll chat to you soon. Okay, bye.